Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another lecture in the series Perspectives on Economic Liberty, hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty here at Arizona State University. I'm Ross Emmett. I am the director of the center. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the center's mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. One of the ways that we fulfill that mission is to invite a variety of guests who interrogate our topic by revisiting past debates over the role of economic liberty, evaluate economic liberty's contribution to human betterment for good or ill, and consider its relation to other human values and freedoms that we may hold. Our guest today is Dr. David Rose, professor of economics at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. I'm supposed to slip in here somewhere something like the greatest American economist of the last 50 years or something, but that's just for David's benefit, no. And he's going to speak on the content and subject of his most recent book, Why Culture Matters Most. In his previous book, entitled The Moral Foundation of Economic Behavior, David addressed the fundamental question of free market democratic society. That is, we need pervasive, reflexive trust for a free market-based economy to work properly. Yet that trust is not properly brought forth by individual incentives alone. So how do we get that trust? His answer in that book is the foundation for his argument this afternoon. The moral foundation of economic behavior is a norm of unconditional trustworthiness made possible by a preponderance of people possessing an ethic of duty-based moral restraint, while not regarding moral advocacy as a moral duty. That is, we need a societal morality that builds trust, but doesn't require people constantly preaching at us. Okay? Try that one, okay? So that's pretty clear. As David realized in that earlier book, his argument required a theory of culture to complete. And it's that topic to which David turns today. How do we overcome the free market democracy dilemma? Let's welcome Dr. Rose to the stage to answer that question.
Thank you, Ross, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I know your time is valuable, and I appreciate it very, very much. So, I'm an economist. So why am I bothering to talk about something like culture? I'm supposed to be interested in things like GDP, interest rates, and so on and so forth. Well, rest assured, although I write books on things like moral foundation of economic behavior and why culture matters most, I haven't given up on economics. No way. I don't think that culture is important and economics is not important. I think that's nonsense. I think virtually everything we hold dear in free market societies is irrelevant if we don't get our economics right. I don't believe that economics is in any kind of need for major overhaul or anything like that, because I don't think it's basically wrong. I just happen to believe that if our goal is to explain the differential success of societies, economics alone is not enough. Before the end of the 20th century, economists had, for the most part, already kind of figured out how free market systems work and why they do such a good job of promoting mass flourishing. But the policies that economists advocated did little to improve matters in a number of struggling societies. This was a problem for a very long time, and it led to mounting frustration that became known as the development puzzle. Economists began to wonder if they were missing something important in their models, and that this was leading to grave policy errors. So some economists turned their attention to the role that institutions play in providing a foundation for markets. New institutional economists like Ronald Coase, Armin Alchian, Harold Demsetz, Abner Greif, Douglas North, Eleanor Ostrom, and Oliver Williamson began exerting increasing influence on economic research and on economic policy design. More recently, pretty famous economists like Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson have strenuously asserted that the answer to the development puzzle is basically, quote, institutions, institutions, institutions. So enthusiasm for viewing institutions as the critical missing link in the story of the development puzzle has not waned. It is still very strong. But despite the best efforts of organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and a number of NGOs to put all of this new research to work as policy, the majority of the world's population is still not enjoying anything close to what Edmund Phelps calls mass flourishing. In my view, there are several problems with the institutions answer to the development puzzle. In the interest of time, we'll just cover two. First of all, institutions are basically just reliable patterns. They're how we do things. They are the way we do things. And when those patterns are very, very reliable, we don't think it's very risky to transact with others. It makes it easier for us to interact with others. But it's essentially true by definition that if you have a society that does everything the right way, it's going to get a good outcome. So the problem with the institution's explanation is it's so broad it almost ends up being tautological. It's like being asked, why did that building burn down? And in answering, there was a fire. Not incorrect, but not very helpful either. It begs the question of why there was a fire. Similarly, someone could ask you, why does that, in that society, are there so many people impoverished? And answering, well, it has very weak institutions. Now, it's almost true by definition, so it can't be wrong, but it really isn't helping very much. It obviously begs the question of, okay, so why doesn't that country have better institutions? The second problem with the institutions explanation is that if institutions are the ultimate key to success, why don't struggling countries just simply adopt proven institutions? Now, the truth of the matter is we know a lot about which institutions matter. We know a lot about how institutions can be subverted or corrupted to work to cross purposes of maximizing social welfare. There's no deep mysteries here. There's no deep puzzles to solve. And there's certainly plenty of proven templates and rich countries eager to help struggling nations with their adoption. The same could be said for adopting good economic policies. Yes, certainly we can always do better. There's still much more work to do to be good at economic policy. But in terms of taking a nation from a struggling status to a reasonably wealthy status, there's no big puzzle here. We know what good economic policies look like. Some have argued that all of this is kind of irrelevant because the development puzzle is the result mostly of the problem of corrupt leaders. It's easy to see how leaders who put the welfare of themselves and their families and their cronies ahead of the public good could stifle economic development with self-serving decision-making and policies. Now, this is a very attractive explanation because if it's all about corrupt leaders, then we don't have to wonder if maybe our theories are wrong or maybe our theories are incomplete. We don't have to wonder if maybe we have bad policies because nobody expects a theory or a policy to work well if it's not put into place in a thoughtful and honest way. Secondly, why do some countries repeatedly elect highly corrupt leaders even in fair elections? If the answer to that question is that, well, in many elections all the candidates are corrupt, well, then that begs the question of why is it that in some countries all the candidates are corrupt? Like the institutions explanation, the corruption explanation just seems to beg almost as many questions as it answers. Maybe the real problem is that in many countries, very important institutions are not so easily adopted. Maybe something else must already be in place for them to exist or for them to work well. I came to the conclusion that something else was culture. But my point here is not that culture matters and therefore institutions don't. On the contrary, I now think that the right way to think about economic development is that it is because institutions are so important that culture is so important. Because some institutions can only exist and work well in the right kind of cultural context. David Landis is, or was, a famous economic historian, and this quote is something that he popularized among people in economic history and in development. Peter Drucker's famous management scholar, he's talking about culture here in a more micro sense. It's actually, he popularized that quote, but that's not his original quote. So it's hardly news that culture is possibly important. This is something people have talked about for a long time. Intellectuals used to talk about culture quite a bit. Anthropologists, historians, and lay people never stopped talking about culture. Thanks to the pioneering work of Sam Bowles, Rob Boyd, Herb Gintis, Pete Richardson, and others like Chris Bohm and Natalie Henrich and Joe Henrich and way too many others to mention, we know a great deal about culture, including how evolving culture leads to subsequent genetic evolution or culture gene evolution. Very fascinating stuff, and we actually know a great deal. We now understand that culture is not merely a product of the human genetic recipe. That culture is in fact also a writer of that genetic recipe. So our increasing capacity for culture has led to our becoming increasingly what we regard as human, in a kind of positive feedback story that seems particularly important for humans because we have a particularly highly refined sense of culture. Increasingly over the last few years, sociologists, political scientists, and even some economists have begun to take another look at culture. There's now widespread agreement that with regard to explaining the differential success of societies, culture is simply too important to ignore, even though it can be a very uncomfortable, indeed even politically incorrect subject. But it's one thing to identify a pattern and become convinced that the pattern is important. It's quite another to explain why the pattern is there. My hope is to make progress on explaining the pattern itself. So my work does not compile existing evidence or produce and present new evidence to make the stronger case for the importance of culture. In my view, that case has been made adequately already. In my view, that jury is already in. Now, this diagram provides us a bit of a context for the broader concept of culture and how it can affect the differential success of societies. In my view, for society to be successful, it has to support at least a modest level of mass flourishing or widespread human flourishing. It's possible for society to not support widespread human flourishing and still be successful for some people in the society, but to use the word society properly, I think we mean something that's broader than just a few rich people at the very top. No, you need something like what Edmund Phelps is talking about when he talks about mass flourishing. Now, there's many, many things that go into creating a condition of mass flourishing. No question about it. Many necessary conditions. We could talk about that alone today and fill all the time. But I think most people who live in societies that most other people would deem as those that enjoy mass flourishing would agree that there's a kind of first among equals. There's two things that really seem to matter more than almost anything else. First of all, it's hard to say that you're living in a society that enjoys mass flourishing if people are suffering severe material deprivation. Now, mass flourishing requires at least a reasonable degree of general prosperity. People have enough to eat, people have shelter, people have some kind of reasonable health care. You can fill in whatever blanks you want, but people have to get over a bunch of minimal barriers or thresholds, or we can't really say they're engaging in mass flourishing. At the same time, even if people have all of their material needs taken care of, if they're not free to live their lives as they see fit, it's hard to say that they're enjoying a condition of mass flourishing. Well, I think the jury's also in that if you want general prosperity, a free market system is probably the way to go. We can quibble about exactly what that system should look like, but that's probably, it's probably going to be some kind of variant of a free market system. With freedom, democracy is very important because what democracy does is it gives us a mechanism to sanction leaders who don't respect our freedom. If they don't respect our freedom, we vote them out, and that makes them think twice before they fail to respect our freedom. Now, of course, everybody knows that the free market system and democracy are dependent on a whole bunch of different institutions. That's not news. But fewer people appreciate that many of the institutions upon which the free market system depends and upon which democracy depends are very highly trust dependent. In countries like the U.S., we take contractually coordinated business for granted. But without a trustworthy judiciary, this would be quite foolish indeed. We also take relational contracts that allow us to give discretion to managers so that they can make decisions on the fly with the local knowledge that they have. We take those kinds of things for granted. But these are completely impossible in low trust countries. In low trust countries, the only time we delegate that much discretion is with close family members or very close friends. You can't have a huge corporation where you do that sort of thing. We tend to take democracy for granted. But if we can't trust what politicians promise, then just exactly what is voting for? Now, I know it's great sport to make jokes about politicians and how they're all liars and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is most politicians at least try to do basically what they promise that they will do. If that wasn't true, the whole exercise of democracy would just be total nonsense. And if most people don't trust voting outcomes because they think elections are rigged, this invites all kinds of intrigue and political tribalism. And of course, it invites people to think that, well, maybe we should cheat in the election. After all, the other guys either are or will soon. Whoever goes first wins. In short, low trust undermines trust-dependent institutions that make it easier for us to get things done in the private sector and to use voting for collective choice making in the public sector. You can think of those as the two columns going up the diagram. You've got the private and you've got the public sector, and high trust society is supporting both like two pillars. Growing and sustaining a thriving free market democracy therefore requires the rich soil of a high trust society. Everything that's good for an individual or everything that's good about a society, if you think about it, almost every one of those things is easier to achieve in a high trust society and harder to achieve in a low trust society. Okay, fine. Hard to quibble with that. But you can be forgiven if you say, okay, so what? I mean, how can you possibly quibble with that? You've just said something that has to be true. My point is that the high trust society requires having the right kind of culture. You know, there are many examples of people who live impoverished lives in their home country who come to countries in the West and quickly start to prosper. This is just one of our favorite examples that we like to tell ourselves. We strongly suspect that if we sent them back to their home country, they'd go right back to being poor, as we would too if we went with them. Now, obviously, what changed in that story was not the culture. What changed was the institutional context in which these people found themselves. That seems to be rather strong evidence for the importance of institutions and why, indeed, it's institutions that matter most. But such a conclusion based on that kind of evidence is based on an assumption, an implicit assumption, that culture only works at the micro level. It's a forgivable assumption because that's the way we normally think of culture. But what if culture also works at the macro level? If high trust societies require a cultural foundation, then what we might actually be observing in the example I just gave is what happens when hardworking people from India or Haiti are dropped into high trust societies made possible by culture. Part of the problem in seeing this is that we naturally think about small group trust. We don't naturally think about high trust societies or large group trust. This is because we evolve in small groups. So small group trust and small group cooperation comes rather easily to us. All societies, therefore, have ample small group trust. But if that's true, then small group trust can't possibly explain the differential success of societies. If you have a sample and you have something that varies over that sample, you can't explain that variation with something that does not change in that sample. Large group trust, however, has no reason to be firmly rooted in our genes. first 99.99% of our existence was spent in very, very small groups. There just simply hasn't been time for that. If we're able to sustain large group trust, we're going to have to do it through some kind of invented means. And we've done this in a lot of different ways. We're good at it. We make up alphabets, and we make up words and sentences. We make up numbers and math. We make up a lot of stuff. And one of the things that we've made up are ideas that sustain large group trust. But these kinds of ideas don't have anywhere near the robustness that genes do. So it's quite reasonable to expect large variations in large group trust across societies. There's no particular reason to assume that they're all going to be able to achieve the same amount. So at least large group trust is at least potentially able to explain the differential success of societies. Now, there's a wide variety of levels of large group trust, of course, and I shall argue that high trust societies are ultimately the product of massive intergenerational investment in human capital. Now, by human capital, I mean human capital the way economists traditionally define it. I mean it in a Becker type of sense here. Think about what we mean when we use human capital in economic research. We're usually talking about some kind of idea that's conveyed through education. It gets put into the brain of a person. It gets refined a little bit, and then it makes that person more productive than they would have otherwise been. That greater productivity is good for that person, but it can also be better for everyone else. Well, how is that any different than an idea that could be put into someone's brain through education that affects the way they think about moral issues, for example, that makes them more trustworthy? Being more trustworthy would make them better transaction partners. That would benefit them. But to the extent that their being trustworthy would contribute to a broader, higher trust society, it could also make the whole society more productive and produce gains that are at an entirely different level of aggregation. So this is, in fact, human capital. It's not the way we normally think about it, but it is absolutely human capital. And I think that that's one way to operationalize the ideas that I'm conveying today. Now, such beliefs, as I've just alluded to, are obviously part of society's culture. But here's the kicker. To get the job done, these beliefs must be culturally transmitted. And I will make that case before we finish today. So my central claim is this. It's culture, not genes, geography, institutions, policies, or leadership, that ultimately determines the differential success of society. I know that's a bold claim, but I'm going to try to make you at least see that it might be true by the end of the discussion today. So just as institutions provide a foundation for thriving free market democracy, culture provides a foundation for many of these institutions. Okay, so I define culture in a fairly non-controversial way, a way that echoes one of your colleagues, Rob Boyd, who couldn't be here tonight because he's desperately ill. But at any rate, he's a very, very famous anthropologist, and his definition of culture is pretty close to mine. And here it is. Culture basically pertains to knowledge transmitted across generations through imitation and teaching rather than through genes. Because of this, culture must therefore be relearned, taught and retaught generation after generation. I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. That seems probably pretty close to what you would imagine a definition of culture would be like. Now, humans are not unusual in that they have culture and other animals don't. Many animals have culture. I can't go through a bunch of examples, but I'll go through one. It's been well documented that killer whales, also known as orcas, they live in pods, and different pods have very, very different styles of hunting. Some are the styles are so different that they will only eat fish. Others will always eat mammals first and only eat fish as the last result. But even the way they hunt is very different from pod to pod. And yet any whale from any pod could mate with any other whale of the opposite sex of any other pod. It's one species. Now, what makes humans unusual is that they transmit a staggeringly large amount of knowledge across generations, and almost none of it is transmitted through genes. This means that culture is a much bigger part of the human story than it is the story of other species. The need to reteach knowledge each generation obviously makes culture fragile. But that very fragility allows culture to function like nothing else. Let's think about culture for a minute as a kind of firmware. You know, that's the stuff you download to your smartphone or to your Blu-ray player about every 6 months or a year. Now, at the time you're downloading it, it's flexible. It seems it's functioning kind of like software. It's instructing the chip in the device to do certain things. But after it's been downloaded and you then use the smartphone or use the Blu-ray player, it is functioning effectively like hardware. It really is no different than if instead of downloading that firmware, somebody had etched new pathways on the chip. So depending upon the context, it functions as hardware or software. Analogously, culture is fixed at the moment of decision. And then because it facilitates encoding behavior much like genes do. But unlike genes, culture does not require many generations for change, so it is far more flexible than genes. A capacity for culture therefore gives a species a means for much, much faster adaptation than otherwise. This is a huge survival advantage. When most people think of culture, what comes to mind are culture practices. These are patterns of behavior that are very uniform, very consistent within the group, but are very different across groups. But beliefs are obviously an important part of culture too. Now, not all beliefs are cultural beliefs, of course, but the truer it is that a particular belief is held very uniformly within the group, but not across group, the more accurate it is to call that belief a cultural belief. Of course, many people understand that an important set of cultural beliefs is the set of commonly held moral beliefs. Often, the set of moral beliefs heavily overlaps the set of religious beliefs, but they are not identical sets. There are moral beliefs that people have in some societies that transcend religion. In the United States, for example, we have an almost moral conviction about things like freedom and liberty and all that sort of thing. And those aren't really coming out of any particular religion. They may overlap a little bit, but they aren't equal is my main point there. Now, I submit that there's also a close connection between culture and rationality. Since the ancient Greeks, it's been understood that rationality is an important part of building a good person and building a good society. But while rationality can help us understand the world around us through science and to make better decisions, it can also help us act as shrewder opportunists. I believe the rise of human civilization is largely the story of humans improving their ability to benefit from rationality while keeping the harm that it can do in check. Think of it as human society getting ever better year by year of channeling rationality so it can only be used in certain ways. Before we're through today, I hope to convince you that cultural beliefs gave humans a way to channel rationality that could extend trust far beyond the reach of their small group genes. Now, a society cannot grow richer by simply moving resources around. Oh, sure, some people can get richer by making other people poor, but there's no magic in that. That's not impressive. What's impressive is creating conditions that allow almost everyone in society to do better over time. But to grow richer, that means we need more output per person, and the trick to doing that is cooperation on a grand scale. If there's magic in economics, it is this. Alone, I make 10 units. Alone, he makes 10 units. Working together, cooperating, we make 26. Your brain's automatically expecting the number 20 because that's the way our brains work, but it's not 20, it's 26. That difference of the whole and the sum of the part of 6 is known as the cooperative surplus. The cooperative surplus is everything. There are thousands of papers and hundreds of books on cooperation. Almost all of them are at least fairly right, but all of them are irrelevant if there's no cooperative surplus to give impetus to cooperation in the first place. The cooperative surplus is the big story of human success. It is by piling up cooperative surpluses, that we can support the greatest scale and scope of, we pile up these surpluses by the greatest scale and scope of cooperation, and this is the first step, the necessary first step for achieving general prosperity and therefore mass flourishing. There's just no other way. Moving stuff around doesn't get it done. Now, many of you know that Adam Smith drew attention to a very important form of cooperation, that of effectuating the gains from specialization through the division of labor. In his famous pen factory example, he showed how cooperating to divide tasks by labor they were able to increase productivity by 23,900%. This is an actual example that's in this book. You can actually work out the math, and I have my students do this in principles classes. Nobody can believe it until they do it. Now, that is such an increase, you cannot wrap your mind around it. It's just too much, and there's really nothing else in economics that produces that kind of massive payoff. Clearly, this is the big story. Without this, everything else is just a meaningless detail. So, if humans don't cooperate, they die. Cooperating in small groups is the difference between life and death, and that's what they did, and they survived for the first 99.99% of our current genomic form. So that's no small thing. Smith went on, but small group cooperation only produces a life that we would consider one of abject poverty. It was only after humans began to cooperate reasonably well in reasonably large groups that any kind of prosperity at all began to emerge. So large group cooperation is not an important part of the story of the rise of humans. It is the story. Everything else is the tale. Now, the power of Smith's argument is evidenced by the fact that large group cooperation is very, very common in nature. There are many species of social insects, for example, and they dominate the planet in count and in biomass. But the kind of large group cooperation that arises from these kinds of species comes from precise genetic encoding of behavior on a strict if-then algorithmic basis. This circumvents the problem of individual organisms promoting their interest at the common good, no question about it. But it also makes adapting to changing circumstances impossible within any given generation. As Yuval Noah Harari pointed out in his wonderful book, Sapiens, even better than cooperation per se is flexible cooperation, since it can be adapted to immediate circumstances. Flexible cooperation obviously requires decision-making. And almost by definition, traits that lead to irrational decision-making will lead to bad decisions and poorly executed flexible cooperation. These should die out in competition with ideas that are more rational. So, conversely, traits that support rational decision-making should lead to better decision-making, better executed flexible cooperation, and therefore be reinforced in the gene pool. As primates evolved a more advanced capacity for rationality, this facilitated ever more flexible cooperation. This led them to outcompete other species and even other human groups. In my view, there's little doubt that the evolution of our capacity for rationality co-evolved with flexible cooperation. But as I hinted a few moments ago, an increasing capacity for rationality should also increasingly open the door to opportunism. This is such a huge problem that economists and game theorists have been studying it for a very long time, and there's a number of models in game theory under the auspices of social dilemmas that capture this particular issue. Because we cooperated in small groups for a very long time, we have evolved very strong mechanisms, like feeling guilty when we harm others, to deal with social dilemmas that frequently arise in small group contexts. But as group size increases, these mechanisms tend to falter. Think for a minute about exaggerating a deduction on your taxes in order to get a refund that's $500 larger. Suppose there's only 10 people in society. Well, the calculation's pretty simple. you exaggerate, you get $500 of additional money to you. You're out 10. I'm sorry, you're out 50, so you're up 450. Everybody else is out 50. So 9 other people have lost $50 of benefit by virtue of the harm to the group of having $500 left of federal tax revenue. Now, most of you would never think in a million years about taking a $50 bill out of somebody's wallet when they weren't looking. There's a lot of reasons why that's true, but I'm quite sure all of you would feel terribly guilty if you did it. Now, compare that to the situation in a country like the United States, where you have way over 300 million people. In this case, the benefit to you is $500 minus less than a cent, and the harm done to the other 300 million plus people is way less than 1 cent. Even the poorest person in the United States cannot perceive of a difference in welfare equal to 1 cent. So if the reason why you don't do those sorts of things is because your moral restraint is harm-based, it's going to fall down on the job in large group contexts. But the problem is large group contexts are gigantically important. As Adam Smith also showed, it isn't just a case of division of labor increases productivity. If you increase the group over which you divide labor, productivity goes up even more. Not being able to cooperate in large groups is devastating for any society. Cultural practices address this problem and this whole set of problems that result from large group size and the opportunism that becomes more likely in those kinds of groups through precise patterns of behavior that left no room for opportunism. In doing so, they dramatically increased group productivity. As groups grew larger, they got more complicated because of specialization. Indeed, that's why they got larger, was to effectuate the gains from specialization. But this means that cultural practices had to become ever more detailed to get the job done. So the larger groups became, the more bureaucratic they became. Here's the problem. When behavior is precisely scripted by cultural practices, our minds get used to automatically searching for the appropriate then response to any given if circumstance. This has the effect of bottling up rationality, because not deviating from established norms is how you stay out of trouble by signaling that you're not opportunistic. You always do things the way we always do it. On the other hand, carefully thinking about alternative ways of doing things that might be better for everybody is a great way to arouse suspicion that you're up to no good. And we all know of particular cultures where you can feel that in the background. You can feel that people are afraid to be creative, to put it out there, because they know they may draw unwanted attention on themselves by doing so. At the same time, precluding opportunism by scripting behavior has the effect of taking all other actions off the table. This means that when circumstances change, the best possible action might not be thought of, let alone taken. So while strict cultural practices reduce the risk of opportunism, they also reduce the likelihood that an action that would improve social welfare will be taken, even when it's obvious that it would, because people were afraid to do it. There is therefore a huge trade-off between large group cooperation and flexible cooperation, because using cultural practices to prescribe behavior to control the growing problem of opportunism is the very antithesis of flexible cooperation that's fueled by rational thinking. This trade-off kept flexible groups small and kept large groups inflexible. Clearly, any group that could circumvent this trade-off would have the best of both worlds and would therefore enjoy a huge survival advantage. This is where cultural beliefs, specifically moral beliefs, enter the story. One possible way to break open the floodgates of flexible large group cooperation would be the evolution of moral beliefs that are able to bottle up opportunism even in large group context. If a society can bottle up opportunism, it doesn't have to fear rationality being put to work to benefit the individual at the expense of the common good. In other words, bottling up opportunism removes the need to bottle up rationality. I'll say it again. Bottling up opportunism removes the need to bottle up rationality. Some institutional scholars have insisted that adding culture to the story of economic development is much ado about nothing. For them, culture is already accounted for in their system through the concept of informal institutions. Now, it's true that many cultural practices are functionally equivalent to informal institutions. You can have a new institutional economist standing here, and you can have a cultural anthropologist standing here, and they're watching some people interact out there. They can be doing exactly the same thing. The one guy says, well, that's an informal institution. The other guy says, well, that's a cultural practice, and they're both right. Now, since humans had culture long before they had anything resembling modern institutions that we take for granted today, it's only natural to think of institutions as having had more to do with economic development, because economic development is an even more recent development in our human species history. So you have, well, let's do it this way. You have, very, very small groups, very primitive societies a long time ago. You have culture. Culture gets a little stronger. Very weak institutions, then stronger institutions, and then we see economic growth and development take off, and that very familiar hockey stick that goes like that at the very end. Okay, it's really easy then to look at that and say, well, I guess what that means is humans have always had culture, but they haven't had any kind of institutions like that until recently, so it must be the institutions that made all the difference. But perhaps institutions did not become more important than culture to unleash the modern world. Perhaps it was cultural beliefs that became more important than cultural practices to open the door to large group trust and therefore flexible large group cooperation. So perhaps the real tipping point in human advance was that cultural beliefs eventually became a superior substitute to cultural practices because cultural beliefs provided a way to suppress opportunism without suppressing rationality generally. And I'm not suggesting that one day somebody discovered this and then said it and then they knew it and they did it. There's fits and starts, many, many failed attempts at innovations to new kinds of moral ideas. Most of them lead nowhere. Many of them lead to disastrous outcomes. But in some societies, they started to wander to a direction that was able to produce a superior way of suppressing opportunism than through cultural practices. So, how would such trust-producing culture actually work? Well, the foundation of a high-trust society is that it's rational to presume others can be trusted in most circumstances because there's a social norm of trustworthiness. There have been some people who have written about trust and said, well, it's all about getting people to be willing to trust. That's nonsense. Exhorting people to trust others when there is no foundation of trustworthiness is not going to be sustainable. They'll quickly learn that that's a bad idea. Now, in such a high-trust society that's based on trustworthiness, transaction costs are obviously going to be very low. This makes the scale and scope of transactions through which the gains from cooperation can be realized very large. In this way, trust makes us richer by helping us pile up those cooperative surpluses I talked about earlier. At the same time, being able to trust that voting will be honestly conducted helps ensure trust in the democratic process. This helps ensure that democracy will effectively check tyranny. Okay, all well and good, but how on earth does the society go about producing trustworthy individuals? As Robert Frank explained long ago in his remarkable book, Passions Within Reason, the key is ensuring that they never act on what he calls golden opportunities. He introduced this idea of golden opportunity to clarify our thinking. A golden opportunity is an opportunity to behave as an opportunist where you believe there's no chance whatsoever of being caught. So what he's trying to do is to make you be careful to not think of a situation where incentive compatibility matters. This is not a case of incentive compatibility because there is absolutely no chance of being caught. So the idea here is that you have a person that you can trust, and you know that that person can be trusted even if circumstances change. So what made it in their best interest to do as they said they would is no longer true. They'll still do what they promised that they would do, even though you can't possibly catch them. That's what a golden opportunity is. And his point is, when we use the word trust, we are not talking about assurance in the sense of Toshio Yamagishi or incentive compatibility, as economists like to talk about. We really are talking about someone that we can expect will do what they said they were going to do or not do what they said they weren't going to do, no matter what. That's what we really use the word trust for. In my first book, I explain why if people possess moral beliefs that produce a strong sense of duty to never behave opportunistically, what I call duty-based moral restraint, then they'll never act on golden opportunities. So what I was trying to do is put some meat on the bones of Frank's argument. So duty-based moral restraint is just this idea that one always obeys prohibitions against negative moral actions, and they do so as a matter of principle. They think these things are inherently wrong. Duty-based moral restraint therefore remains in force even in groups where harm can be diluted, like in my example involving tax deduction. Duty-based moral restraint requires that the good that might be done by, or might be made possible by disobeying a moral prohibition is to not even be considered. It's not appropriate to consider these things. So duty-based moral restraint has the effect of keeping greater good rationalizations from undermining our ability to trust others. Just think of it this way. There's this guy over here. You're thinking about trusting him. If you believe that he could convince himself that by harming you a little bit in a way that you would never catch, he could help all these people over here in a great way, he might do that. And even if you endorsed the sentiments that are guiding his thinking, you would still prefer trusting this guy who would never do that, ever. So the better approach in a society is let's just always keep our word, make a whole lot of money, and then have plenty to take care of these problems because we'll be rich enough to do so if we don't undermine trust along the way. Now, duty-based moral restraint affects behavior in a very different way than genes or cultural practices do. Duty-based moral restraint does not precisely prescribe behavior. Instead, duty-based moral restraint precisely proscribes behavior. This difference is very, very significant. Logically, precisely prescribing behavior effectively redacts all other possible actions. For any if a corresponding unique then is dictated, this renders freedom meaningless. But precisely proscribing behavior has a very different effect because it redacts only a very small part of the action set. This leaves the rest of the action set, and this includes, by the way, actions that no one has even thought of yet, to the discretion of the individual. This is the very essence of adult freedom. Adults don't expect to be able to be free to do whatever it is they want to do, whenever it is they want to do it, whomever it is they want to do it to. That's not what adults expect, and adults certainly don't want to live in that kind of society because they can forecast how they could be on the short end of that stick. What adults are looking for when they say they want to be free is they want to say, look, unless there's a very specific, clear reason why I can't do something, it's appropriate for me to presume that I can. That's the kind of freedom that would be consistent with duty-based moral restraint. The example I like to give is imagine you've got a family, they live really close to a cinema. The cinema has 10 separate screens, and they live so close, even young children can just walk to the cinema. I used to do this when I was a kid. Maybe that's dated, I don't know. But if the kids are little, you can imagine the parent saying this, look, you can go to the movies, but you can only see this picture or this picture. That's it. Might be 2 Disney movies. When the kid gets a little older, though, the same conversation would probably produce the following kind of statement from the parent. Okay, you can go to the movies. I don't care which movie you go see, but not this one and not this one. That's a huge difference. In the first case, you specifically prescribed a behavior and you knocked it down to just 2 options. In the second case, you specifically proscribed a behavior and only took out 2 options. In the second case, the child, 5 or 6 years older, is 4 times freer than they used to be. That reversal from prescription to proscription is hugely important to the concept of freedom itself. So what does this mean? If you never take a negative moral action because you strongly believe it's your moral duty, indeed your only moral duty not to do so, then you will never, ever behave opportunistically, so you will never, ever behave in an untrustworthy way. It follows that if a strong ethic of duty-based moral restraint exists in the vast majority of individuals in society, there will be a strong norm of trustworthiness that will make it rational to extend trust even to strangers in all but the most exceptional of circumstances. Duty-based moral restraint is attractive to me because it also comports with Aristotle's emphasis on moral behavior being a matter of habits. If you never take negative moral actions because you anticipate that you'll experience a great deal of guilt if you do, then eventually your subconscious will stop wasting resources by treating behaving in an untrustworthy way as an open question. In other words, when an opportunity to benefit from being untrustworthy presents itself, the brain no longer routes the thinking through the rather expensive cost-benefit analysis processing part of the executive function, and it simply loops around to the answer, no. So you don't refrain from being untrustworthy because of external incentives or incentive compatibility. You refrain from being untrustworthy because untrustworthy actions have been effectively redacted from the set of actions over which rational decision-making is conducted. But here's the beautiful thing. Duty-based moral restraint, therefore, only takes the opportunistic part of rationality off the table. Recall that if a society can bottle up opportunism, it does not have to fear rationality being put to work to benefit the individual at the expense of the common good. This makes it unnecessary to precisely prescribe behavior through cultural practices to crowd out opportunism because the opportunism problem has already been dealt with. Now, this sounds too good to be true. So what's the catch? There's got to be a catch. It can't be that simple. The catch is, and you're going to love this, I promise, the catch is choosing to adopt moral beliefs that would effectuate an ethic of duty-based moral restraint is irrational. If we ignore morality for a moment, no one would rationally choose to have moral beliefs that foreclose acting on all future golden opportunities. To do so would be to contradict the definition of rationality or contradict the definition of golden opportunity. So how might societies deal with this rationality catch-22 to get trust-producing moral beliefs into the brains of its citizens? The answer, incredibly, unbelievably, is culture. Remember that I said the need to reteach cultural beliefs each and every generation was both a blessing and a curse. The curse, you'll recall, was that it made culture very fragile compared to genes. The blessing is that the intergenerational transfer of knowledge allows the present generation to decide for the next one, for the most part, what the moral beliefs and moral tastes of that next generation will be. This circumvents the rationality catch-22 problem because society isn't depending upon its citizens to irrationally choose to adopt trust-producing moral beliefs for themselves. Think about it. The hallmark of any culture is early childhood education. This is so universal because it works so well. It works so well because the younger a child is when she learns something, the more likely she will not be able to fully appreciate the full ramifications of treating what she's learned as an immutable fact of life as an adult. If duty-based moral restraint is drummed in early enough, often enough, and strongly enough, then by the time she can appreciate the cost of not being able to act on golden opportunities, she would have long ago come to view untrustworthy behavior as unworthy of consideration. So she isn't trustworthy because she has an incentive to be trustworthy. We're only talking about golden opportunities here. She isn't trustworthy because of the power of her moral conviction overpowers the power of temptation. She is trustworthy mostly because she isn't actually even tempted in the first place, because she doesn't really consider behaving in an untrustworthy way in the first place. Now, if that sounds crazy to you, think about it for a minute. We all know people like that. It never even crosses their mind. I tortured Oliver Williamson with an example of this once that we can talk about later if you want. We all know people like that. I hope all of you are people like that. The best societies have lots of people like that. And such societies are abuzz with cooperation because people don't spend much time worrying about being cheated. They don't have to. In such societies, cooperative surpluses pile up every which way to make nearly all of us rich compared to just a few generations ago. In such societies, the unlikelihood of being victimized makes nearly all of us feel safe, so we can let our guard down. I like to think of it this way. Just as social insects use genes to encode behavior to circumvent opportunism, in some societies, humans use moral beliefs to encode behavior through moral tastes that exert their influence over decision-making upstream from rational calculation. By effectuating restraint through moral taste, some human societies essentially rob rational calculation from its ability to help us talk ourselves into doing things like behaving in an untrustworthy way. Now, let me make sure I don't bury the headline right here at the end. The cultural transmission of trust-producing moral beliefs results in the present generation, for the most part, choosing the beliefs of the next. This separates the decision to have certain kinds of moral beliefs from the consequences of having to abide by them later in adulthood. Nothing, and I mean nothing else, works like this. There is no functional equivalent in the institutional paradigm. Genes, cultural practices, institutional routines all deal with the problem of opportunism by crowding in precise behaviors. So the better the job that genes, cultural practices, and institutions do suppressing opportunism, the more they crowd out rationality with conformity. Run to its logical extreme, this produces a society of suffocating Kafkaesque bureaucracy that destroys the human spirit. But in a few societies, prevailing moral beliefs evolve that solve the problem of individual rationality undermining the common good in an entirely different way by producing something reasonably close to duty-based moral restraint, where these beliefs are strongly and widely inculcated. A norm of trustworthiness that makes the high-trust society possible emerges. Because of the unique way that duty-based moral restraint works, in such societies, rationality became free to roam in our minds, free to help us do science, free to help us be creative, free to help us think for ourselves. This unlocked the power of cooperation as never before. This unbridling of the rational mind and freedom to fuel flexible large group cooperation is the real explanation for the rise of the modern world and mass flourishing. This is why culture matters most. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have time for some questions, and I will turn it over to people. I'll come around with the microphone. I think we might have two mics. Is there another one there? No.
There is another microphone over here.
Okay. So I may enlist somebody's help to help me move it around. And you have a question? Okay.
So if this element of trust is so important to be part of a cultural practices and everything a culture does, there's clearly some societies that do that better than others. Does that mean that there's cultural superiority where some cultures are better than others? And if that's true, then does that justify some sort of like civilizing mission of other cultures onto others?
Great question, although I don't really like the question, because it really puts me on the spot. It is a great question, and I think it's a bit of an ethical dilemma. It kind of reminds me of the situation that the Christian church was put in with missionaries who frequently presumed that we should just come in, we know the way, and it's our duty to tell people the way. I don't think any such burden is on us, even if I am certain that I'm right and I'm not certain that I'm right. And even if all of you are certain that I'm right and I'm pretty sure you're not certain that I'm right. That doesn't mean that we have to go out and press this, or it's appropriate for a country that had the power to impose this to do so. If this is correct, and I think it basically is, there's absolutely no reason why this cannot be done through the sheer force of persuasion. There are no major world religions that conflict with anything I've said. This is all extracurricular when it comes to religion. These are auxiliary beliefs on top of religion. If you talk to an imam or a rabbi or a priest or a preacher about these ideas, they will all say, oh, that's absolutely right. They'll agree with you. The difference is they've never worked out a framework that can impress upon people the material benefits and the long-term dynamic benefits to cumulative economic growth that comes from being able to have this recursive kind of investment in human capital layer after layer after layer. This can be worked out, by the way, in a pretty mathematical way, which I'm working with a co-author on doing now. So that's the thing that's missing, is that by doing a little bit more sacrifice now, we can benefit future generations a great deal. You know, on this campus, you see all kinds of evidence of people who are very, very, very eager to do something that amounts to a self-sacrifice for them, for the benefit of others or the benefit of future generations. That's where most of this enthusiasm for environmentalism is, the concern about global warming. This is sincere. It's real. People feel it in their bones. There's no reason why people can't feel in their bones the imperative of teaching that not doing the don'ts needs to come before doing the do's if we're going to create the kind of society that we know our children are going to want to live in.
Thank you for that really interesting talk. I think I can agree with almost everything you said, and my question follows up on the previous one, really. How do you transform a low-trust society into a high-trust society? And just sort of picking up your response to that in terms of sort of existing moral systems and religions and so forth, those are subject, though, to interpretation, right? Whether it's Christian or Islam or Buddhism. And it's that interpretation in each society that I think would be different. Again, you're pushing the problem back, right? You want to interpret these doctrines in such a way that you have generalized trust and trustworthiness operating. So again, I don't know if that exactly answers the question, so I'll push you a little bit farther. How do you inculcate that foundational kind of norms that would result in that kind of generalized trust?
I'm going to treat that as two separate questions. One thing I deal with in the book in great detail, but I did not have time to deal with here at all, is I make the distinction between culture as content and culture as instrument. And when you do that, it allows you to see how culture, because it's so powerful everywhere, it can become a source of grinding poverty for societies. In other words, a society, if it's not careful, can get caught in what I call cultural lock-in. Because if you have a society that has regimented cultural practices, that does everything it can to suppress the kinds of things that I'm talking about, you can be in a situation where there are no adults that were ever raised in families that ever opened any of these kinds of doors cognitively to them when they were children. And so you see this repeated generation after generation after generation after generation. So I don't know that there's always a way out. And I think we all know, we can all imagine in our minds certain examples of certain societies where you know that if you were one when you were dropped in that society and raised from the age of 1 on, you would be exactly like the people in that society. You would have their views, and you would be exactly the kind of person that's causing problems for people in our society. You know that that's true, and you also know that there's a kind of futility to getting out of it. But that futility of getting out of it doesn't undermine the cultural argument. It shows the power of the cultural argument as instrument. So that's how I would answer the first half of the question. The second half of the question is, in the United States over the last 40 years or so, we have dramatically increased the spending at K through 12 on character and morals education. The amount of money we spend on character and morals education, particularly in public schools at K through 12, is staggering. There are professors that do nothing but work on this sort of thing, come up with teacher training programs. And those of you who remember school when you were little, but now have gone to school for your grandchildren or your own children, you've noticed that there's just way more moralizing going on in the classroom, a whole lot more of that sort of thing than there was when we were younger. And the type of moralizing is different. When I was a kid, and for those of you at my age or older, there was certainly some moral instruction, but it was almost all about not doing the don'ts. Keep your hands to yourself. Don't lie. Don't steal your. It was always about don't do the negatives. It wasn't a whole lot of do this. There was some exhortation, but not much. Today, way more on the exhortation, way less on not doing the don'ts. That is a gigantic amount of money. Some of what people have been able to achieve is a good thing. Not all of it is bad. If you look at the students around here that are, say, 25 and younger, even 30 and younger, they are nicer than we were. We weren't that nice. I mean, we just weren't. And I can tell you, the kids I grew up with weren't that nice. Kids are simply nicer now than they used to be. That's a good thing. I mean, that's a good thing. I think most kids are nicer than they used to be, and I think that's a good thing. I could be wrong about that. But so some of that has been good stuff, but some of these ideas are very, very contrary to duty-based moral restraint. I mean, they're like the exact opposite. Let me give you an example. There was one scholar I heard of, and this was printed in the newspaper, where he was talking about how new thinking about teaching characters and morals is changing the landscape and making things better. And he was urging that we not teach children that lying is wrong. Instead, we should teach them to value being honest. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all for teaching kids to value being honest. There's nothing wrong with that. But you see what he's done there? He's flipped it. He's trying to get the behavior he wants on the positive side of the story rather than through redaction, which is where the real action is on making reliably trustworthy people. This is a debate that's not happening. He's able to teach this, and it's treated as received psychological wisdom and science. It is not. It is drivel, and it is dangerous. If you look at how business ethics is taught today, let's just say I'm very disappointed in the business ethics program. Much of business ethics is just applied ethics, and it takes a lot of these kinds of ideas and runs with them. It doesn't have any kind of attention paid to the context of business, what makes business unique, and how business uniquely contributes to the betterment of society. Now, that's a huge problem, because if you're going to tell people how to behave in a particular context, you might want to know what it is that thing's supposed to be doing in the first place, because you can't possibly know what they're supposed to be doing if you don't know what it's supposed to be doing. The way business ethics is taught is just completely divorced from that. There's no positive theory for how business contributes to the common good. None. It's just ignored.
Thank you for a very interesting and inspiring presentation. Actually, the idea that our brain doesn't register the word doesn't, is probably what made this teaching about teaching kids to be honest rather than not lying possible, but I've heard it's a myth after all. I have one question, or rather two questions maybe. So, you've earlier said that free market institutions and democratic institutions come from high trust society, right?
Well, I don't say that they come from high trust societies, but I do say that a number of the institutions that are critical for getting maximum performance are highly trust dependent. So in a high trust society, you're going to get way more mileage out of each. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say there are democracies that are in low trust countries. There's many of them.
Oh, and this leads to my second question.
Yeah.
Is there even any point in promoting or enforcing, inputting democratic institutions or free market institutions in low trust countries and in low trust societies where culture doesn't really allow it?
Well, that's pretty close to his question earlier, really. Is there a point to it? Well, if you care about other human beings, I guess there is. I mean, if you think, you have to be careful. We don't want to be deciding for people what's best for them. I mean, that's really quite, if you're an economist, that's something that you really don't like to do because that's a common mistake that's been made by people, and we don't need it in our framework, so we really try to avoid that. But it is nevertheless true that people can sometimes do things that's not in their best interest because they don't understand the consequences of their behavior fully. What that means then to me is that the only legitimate opening you have is to go to countries like that and to talk to people and to give speeches and get on TV and whatever, sell books and whatnot, to make the case that this society can do a lot better in terms of having fewer people who are starving and fewer people who don't have adequate shelter and so on. So you can do a lot better if you will look at these issues in a little different way. We're not telling you to abandon your religion or anything like that. We're telling you to stress some of this over here a little more than this over here. But one thing that I think that I wasn't able to talk about at all that kind of is pertinent a little bit to what you're talking about is democracy. I think you probably thought I was going to take the bait on that democracy thing. And in my view, democracy is not nearly as exceptional as people think that it is. If you look at careful archaeological and anthropological evidence, you will find humans are quite naturally democratic. Democracy is a very common thing. Democracy is not hard for us. We've got a lot of direct observation on this. But what people forget is there's a huge difference between an evolved collective decision-making process when that process is in the context in which it evolved versus that decision-making process in a different context. Small group democracy is very stable, works very well, it's very efficient, it's basically written in our genes. We naturally expect it to be a good thing. The problem with democracy comes when you blow it, try to scale it up into large groups. So Greece gets all of the press because it's the first really big democracy. Yeah, it was also the first really big failed democracy. And then Rome, ditto, and we can just keep going and going and going and going. I have a quote for you. I have a whole bunch of them, but I'm just going to give you one. I'm going to ask you if you know who said this, okay? This is a guy writing a letter to his wife. Remember, democracy never lasts. It soon exhausts, wastes, and murders itself. Who do you think said it?
John Adams to Abigail.
John? Wow. Well done. John Adams, and by the way, he wasn't in some kind of philosophical debate. He's talking to his wife, who was indisputably brilliant, and he frequently made it very clear, without her, I am nothing. And she did appear to be pretty sharp. And so they would have these kinds of debates. He really meant what he was talking about. He wasn't just having a bad day. Democracy, on the scale that we were thinking about instantiating it here in this country, in fact, we already had it in some degree already, those don't work. They're very, very, very hard. The free market democracy is wonderful, and it is spectacularly difficult. And because it's spectacularly unstable. It's unstable because the mechanisms that tend to support these high trust types of things wane quickly with large group context. And in the book, I lay out clearly how as a society grows and becomes more prosperous, it reduces the optimal level of investment, of inculcation of these beliefs. So we have a dynamic human capital investment problem, and we can show that I'm getting a little technical here, I apologize, but we can show that there's a free rider problem associated with this investment due to the spillover effects of this type of behavior, and that intensifies. So that in turn explains why when societies tend to be really dominant for a while, they almost always unravel. In fact, they always have. There are no exceptions. I mean, we're not an exception yet. The end of history is not here.
My question was kind of along those lines. As you mentioned in the beginning, we can see people losing faith in public education, business, government, voting processes. Do you think that we're changing from a high-trust society to a low-trust society, or were these elements always present? And then where do you think the tipping point might be for that?
You ever heard of the book Bowling Alone? It's about the social capital. There's pretty good evidence that trust in the United States has been sliding fairly steadily for the last 50 years, and also in most of the Western world. Does that fit my story? Well, I don't know. Let's think about it for a minute. I made the argument that the high trust society is a product of massive intergenerational transfer of knowledge that amounts to massive investment into human capital. Have there been things that have been happening over the last 50 years that would reduce that rate of human capital investment? And the answer is, oh yes. There's been gigantically. And in fact, you can look at rich countries and you can say, hey, this isn't all just about countries. This theory applies even to groups within countries. Pick a group that's struggling within a country. Take a look at their level of investment. Take a look at how many intact families they have. Things like that that would hurt that investment should produce an outcome that's exactly like you'd expect in a low-trust society. So I think that things are not going in the right direction right now. I think many people want to talk about our current political travails in terms of politics per se, but I really believe what you're really observing is a process by which what's normally a single peak set of political preferences driving to a polar system where you have two poles and they're pushing apart further and further and further. Why? Well, as trust goes down, suspicion goes up. As suspicion goes up, confirmatory bias has people finding more and more evidence of why the other guy is bad. Making a proactive argument and making proactive political favoritism to help yourself, that works, that's great, but it's subject to diminishing returns. Now here's the gift that keeps on giving. I'm not going to give you money to vote for me. I'm going to tell you that if you vote for her instead, all these horrible things are going to happen. How much did that cost me? Almost nothing. And a person's ability to do harm far exceeds their ability to do good. So by vilifying each other, we've kind of moved to a new level of political tribalism. It's very predictable in this situation, and this is worked out in the last two chapters of my book. So political tribalism is a very easily predicted outcome of falling levels of trust in a society that once had such high levels of trust that you could have things as crazy as Democratic senators and Republican senators playing basketball, which was happening not so long ago. That was not that long ago. It is very scary that we're starting to see even things like that become a problem.
We have a question here.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the speech. My question's kind of drawn from Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions, and where basically he has the idea that there's people that might agree on what's morally virtuous for an end result, but there's drastically different visions on how we're going to get to that vision. Like you have Keynes and Hayek, who both are, end of the day, looking for full employment, but they have drastically different conceptions on how to get to full employment. So I guess my question would be, how do we bridge that gap between those visions and how to get to the same result?
A Conflict of Visions was a book that when I read it, I thought to myself, I have to write a book like this or die trying. I was so moved by that book. The basic thesis of that book, let me paraphrase the first couple paragraphs, and you'll remember them. They said now this is going to be a very weak exercise in paraphrasing, but I think Sowell will forgive me. But he said, look, we have this phenomenon where over and over and over again we have two sides, not three, not seven, always two, looking at each other over a chasm. It happens repeatedly. It happens too often to be random, but it's too haphazard to be a plot. Something must be going on behind the scenes that's driving this result. What he's saying in economic parlance is this is some kind of emergent equilibrium phenomenon. So you've got to understand the processes that are producing this equilibrium if you understand what's going on. And then, of course, his theory was that there are competing visions, the constrained and the unconstrained vision, and then really everything kind of comes down to that. Adam Smith was on the constrained visions part of that divide, as was everyone else in the Scottish Enlightenment. Now, I want you to think about which countries in the world did better from the period of, say, 1700 on. The ones that followed Adam Smith and his ilk did pretty well. The ones that went the other way, not so much. Adam Smith, in his first book, most people know about The Wealth of Nations, which was written in 1776. But what most people do not know is that Adam Smith was able to write that book because he was already an international celebrity. In 1759, he wrote A Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it made him a sensation. He did a lot of fascinating things in that book. We could talk for a week about it easily. But one of the things that he pointed out in that book was the difference between a society based on justice versus beneficence. Boy, that comes really close to this idea of the difference between moral restraint and moral advocacy. Is it more important to not do the don'ts, or is it more important to do the do's? And Adam Smith made the argument that the best societies do both. And he had very little patience for people who wanted to get by on the moral cheap. But he also said, without a doubt, a society can do pretty well just on justice, even if it forgets the beneficence. It certainly doesn't need to do the beneficence as a part of a kind of public effort that should be left to private hands. What does that have to do with what we're talking about today? Duty-based moral restraint overlaps this dichotomy that was proposed by Smith, that was so beautifully discussed by Sowell in that book. It overlaps it pretty well. And I would say that the world that was basically resulted from the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, it's a pretty good world. Not a perfect world. It's not a world that can't be improved upon. Absolutely can. But still, pretty good world.
Hello.
Sorry. He's telling you to go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the visit. Being in agreement with I would say the core of your argument that culture and trust are really the most important things for flourishing economies and societies. I was wondering how it matches, especially the model is my problem. And now that you are aware of the imperfections of democracy, the best example that we have in the last years is the rise of a lot of people to middle class in China, which is not a democratic society. So how do you reconciliate that flourishing society of the last years in your model where democracy seems to be just a step before flourishing societies?
That's a fantastic question. It's a question I actually worked on for quite a while, a number of years ago in a couple of papers. You can do pretty well in the world being 15 years behind a country like the United States. You can do pretty well in the world being 50 years behind a country like the United States. But if you look at the path-breaking, total factor productivity increasing type innovations of the last 200 years, and increasingly as we get closer to the present, they come from places like the United States. They do not come from China, and they also do not come from Japan.
Exactly.
And I've written papers in Japan on Japanese industrial development on this very topic. So the right way to think about this is that a kind of second best economic development is possible without having a high trust society. No question about it. And I mean, if you do something, if you can only get to 80% without the high trust society, and the high trust society is through the roof, well, that's still pretty good. And so I think that the rapid economic growth that we see in China over the last 30 years is a combination of two things. The first thing is, it's not hard to grow fast when you're going from 1920s to 1970s. Okay, everything you need is on the shelf. That's a pretty easy gap to close. That's going to produce a tremendous amount of extensive growth as you're closing in on the new equilibrium. Now that's terrific, and I'm happy for the Chinese people, and I'm glad that they have more food to eat and so on and so forth. But as they get closer to the developed rate, they're going to find out that their inability to produce a parade of total factor productivity increasing innovations is always going to have them a step behind. To the extent they're basing their growth on that azimuth, it could lead to unrest in China, and I believe it already has. The other reason for the rapid growth that we've seen is very, very clever people manipulating circumstances to produce a lot of growth, but not in ways that are sustainable in the long run. Many of these chickens are coming home to roost. China is in serious, serious trouble. One of the greatest threats to the American economy is the Chinese economy right now. So one thing that Doug loved these ideas, and Doug actually started talking about culture near the end of his life. And I remember the first time he fiddled with it, we were in a talk, and he's doing the chalk, and he's got these loops and circles, and then he'd write beliefs, and he wasn't clear about what he was doing, and then he'd point back to beliefs, and he was very excited. He knew there was something important in the institutional paradigm that was missing. And I spent a lot of time with Doug and all on that sort of thing. And the problem that I saw with that approach was it lacked that ability to produce a culture that could produce a high trust society to get them to that highest possible level. And one of the things that Doug would hammer on me all the time, he says, well, this is too absolute, this is too absolute, it should be a matter of degree. And he was right. He was right. There's no such thing as a perfectly high trust society. That's nonsense. There is a highest trust society among the set of societies. That's true by definition. And that one will benefit from being able to sustain a much larger number of highly trust-dependent institutions than other countries might. But there's no perfect. And in fact, I show in the book, it would be economically inefficient to have you will never get there. It would never be worth the cost necessary to produce moral restraint that would be needed to produce that outcome. It doesn't even make sense. It's a foolish thing. So this is all matters of degree. Societies that have higher levels of generalized trust in each other as well as trust in the system are just going to have a better go of it. It's going to be easier for them to sustain a very productive, rapidly growing economy than not. Other countries can produce confusing signals through catch-up growth that looks like it's the kind of intensive growth that we take for granted. There's really very few countries that have the kind of intensive growth that we have. So to put it in terms of Solow's growth model, it's like the difference between getting to the equilibrium versus popping new ones. We can pop new ones that everybody else can rush to. But here's the one thing we can't do. We can't be the country that everyone else free rides off of and then free ride. That won't work. Yes.
Real quick.
We're almost there, yeah.
Okay, it's fairly quick, I think. So we got a new CIO here at ASU. Just a little over a year ago, I work at the technology office, and he was actually given a Post-it note by Dr. Crow, our president, saying culture eats strategy for breakfast. So he's really been pushing culture. And just my takeaway, at least in trying to bottle opportunism, is you got to get them young. So for hiring, I'm wondering if that means you look for people who have high morals. Is that a good takeaway from this, or is that simplifying it too much when it comes to wanting to have a cooperative organization?
No, that's an outstanding question, and it really cuts to the quick. In my first book, I made very, very clear the issue is not the level of morality. Some of the worst places to live, some of the poorest places to live, some of the most suffocating places to live are some of the most moral places on the planet, where people are so dedicated to their belief in what's right and good and transcendent that they pound it into their children every day, 100 times more than we do. It's not the level of morality that matters. It's the kind of morality that matters. It's how we think about morality that matters, because how the brain actually works through moral decision-making is what governs whether you're going to have someone who is going to exude an ethic of duty-based moral restraint and therefore be trustworthy. So there's a lot of issues in morality. I'm not saying I got the only thing that matters, but what I'm saying is one that really matters a lot when it comes to having a society that's a great kind of place to live and so on is the ability to sustain a high-trust society. Being more moral can actually make you a lower trust society. It can actually contribute more to cultural lock-in. So you never want to fall into the trap of saying, well, because the society is doing poorly, it's not that moral. No, it might be crazy moral. I mean, it may just be, there might be tremendous effort being put into inculcating moral beliefs. And those moral beliefs may be perfectly legitimate when judged in their own way, but they might not be particularly effective at sustaining large group trust. And if they aren't, you can be stuck in a bad equilibrium for a long time.
Let's thank Dave for his talk.